I am incredibly humbled and privileged to stand here and speak to you today. I don't often speak to members of the public. I often speak to scientists and clinicians and grant funding agencies, but rarely do I speak to members of the public. The only reason I do my work is because I believe it is good for people, for members of the public. So that's why this is important for me to stand here now. At the beginning, Eric explained to you a little bit about the Lund University Diabetes Center and told you it's probably the best place in the world to do diabetes research. One of the reasons it's probably the best place in the world is because it's in Sweden. And Sweden is a magnificent society within which to do biomedical research. We have excellent support from the government and other funding agencies. But most importantly, we have excellent support from people like you, the people who are interested in diabetes and many of whom participate in research studies. So thank you, and I hope what I'm going to tell you now is of some interest to you. So the research that I do is mainly related to the interplay between your lifestyle, what you eat, whether you smoke, how much physical activity you do, and your genome, the thing that you inherit from your parents that encodes all of the proteins that are within your body. And that interaction between the genome and your lifestyle probably dictates those who will go on to develop diabetes and those who won't. And so that's an interesting area for clinicians and researchers to try to figure out, but it's a tricky one. Now, there are many, many people on this planet who have diabetes, probably not far off 500 million people. And there are probably 2 to 3 times more people who have blood glucose levels that haven't quite reached diabetes but are elevated. So there are so many people on this planet who either have diabetes or are at risk of developing the disease. It is an enormous problem, and it's a big problem in Sweden. So 1 in 12 people worldwide have diabetes. Many of them won't know they have the disease. And not knowing that you have the disease is problematic in itself because, as you probably know, there are ways in which we can intervene to slow down and maybe even prevent the onset of complications with diabetes. And if you don't know that you have the disease, then clearly that is a major problem. Now, most of the new cases of diabetes that will emerge over the next decades, and there will be many, there will be hundreds of millions more people with diabetes in the next 20 years than there are today. Most of those new cases will come from the very large countries in the world, like China and India. That makes sense. But they will also be driven by the fact that those societies are moving from traditional agricultural farming lifestyles towards westernized, Americanized lifestyles. And Swedish society is also moving in that direction. And it's really that change in lifestyle that is pushing this diabetes epidemic up. And that's something that's been recognized for quite a long time and is something that we think we can do something about to some extent, but maybe we can do better. Now, of course, diabetes is diagnosed on the basis of elevations in blood glucose. That's the test that's done to tell whether or not people have diabetes. But it's caused by defects in all different aspects of the body, in the brain, in adipose tissue, in the fat tissue, in the kidneys, in the muscles, in your legs and your arms and the rest of your body, in the intestines, in the liver, and then ultimately in the pancreas where insulin is produced. So there are lots and lots of different ways in which diabetes can be caused, things that can go wrong with the body that can cause blood glucose to rise and diabetes to begin. And there are drugs that will target most of these defects to some extent. But lifestyle is the one-stop shop for diabetes prevention. If you can improve your lifestyle so that you can reduce your body weight and you can modify your diet so you don't eat harmful foods and you don't smoke, all of these things will have an impact pretty much on the whole body, whereas a drug tends to work on a single organ at a time. So lifestyle is the miracle drug for diabetes prevention. And this is the study that really demonstrated that for the first time. It's called the Diabetes Prevention Program, and it was based in the US. Now, this is a study that includes about 3,000 people who were at high risk of getting type 2 diabetes because they had high levels of blood glucose that weren't quite at a diabetic level, but they were still elevated. And these people were overweight and obese when they started the trial. And 1,000 participants were randomly assigned to receive intensive lifestyle interventions. So they went to exercise classes, they met with dietitians, and they were coached on how to reduce their body weight. About 1,000 other participants received a drug called metformin that you may know about, and that's the drug that's often used as the first drug in the therapeutic regime to treat diabetes, but in this study, it was given before the onset of diabetes, and that drug can lower the glucose in the body by reducing the amount of glucose produced in the liver. And then the last 1,000 participants were randomized to receive a placebo pill, which is just a pill that does nothing but looks like the metformin drug, and standard advice about lifestyle. So that was the control arm. And what you can see is that the intervention that had the biggest impact on diabetes, in other words, where these curves go up the least, is lifestyle. So lifestyle had this major impact. These are the people who just received the standard care. These are the people who received metformin, and these are the people who got lifestyle. And the steeper this curve, the more people are developing diabetes during this clinical trial. So lifestyle had a dramatic impact to reduce the risk of developing diabetes in people at high risk. And importantly, it had about twice the impact of the best drug that's available, metformin, to reduce diabetes incidence. So it truly is the miracle drug to slow down the onset of diabetes. Now, this is a cartoon that I used to show a lot when I gave talks, and I stopped doing that a few years ago, but I dug this one out because it might make some sense. It might convey the point I'm trying to get across. Now, these are achillea plants, and there are 7 genetic varieties of this particular plant shown in this cartoon. And each of those 7 genetically different achillea plants have been cloned. In other words, a cutting has been taken, and 3 versions of that plant have been grown. Now, these plants were grown, and this is a real study that was done in Spain, in the mountains in Spain. They were grown at either a high elevation, a medium elevation, or a low elevation, at the top of the mountain, halfway down the mountain, or at the bottom of the mountain. And what it shows you is that the plants grow to different heights, depending on their elevation and on their genotype. The genetics of the plant matters, and where on the mountain they were grown matters. But interestingly, there are some plants that grow tall at the bottom of the mountain and at the top of the mountain, but not halfway up, halfway down. And there are other plants that will always be quite short. And so that you get all these different varieties of plant height depending on both the genotype and the environment, which is how high up they're grown. Now, probably we're not that interested in how tall a plant grows and whether it's grown at the top or the bottom of a mountain. But what we are interested in is how people within populations, and this is a population of plants, how their health will fare depending on their genotypes and the environments in which they live. In other words, what their lifestyles are like. And probably if we want to if we want to treat or prevent or treat diabetes optimally as well as we can, we have to consider both the genotype of the person and the environment within which they're living, and put those things together to reach the optimal health outcome. So people who grow plants like to know about genetics and where plants are grown, and actually doctors like to know about what people are doing with their lifestyles, and to some extent what their genetics predicts in terms of their disease outcome. Now, the reason that human beings vary, the reason their genetics impacts the way in which they live and their response in terms of disease is partly because of how human beings have evolved over time, over the tens of thousands of years that human beings have populated this planet. And this is an example of all the different ways that human populations have changed genetically to cope with local environmental factors. Now, a very well-known one is malaria and sickle cell anemia. So this is where the red blood cells in the body are genetically malformed to prevent the malaria parasite that's carried by mosquitoes from binding to the red blood cell, reducing the amount of malaria in people who carry that genetic mutation. And so those genetic mutations are very common in equatorial populations, those populations that live close to the equator, because it's been protective against malaria. We also have examples like lactose intolerance. And so lactose intolerance and inability to digest lactose from dairy products is very common in some Scandinavian populations, particularly in Finland. And that's there because of an enrichment that's occurred throughout recent human evolution, genetic enrichment. Then we have examples like marine fat diets. So if you go to Greenland, the Inuits, the Aboriginal population in Greenland, have developed a metabolism that can digest marine fats, fats from whales and seals and other marine life, very efficiently, whereas other populations can't do that. And the way they do that is genetically encoded. So there are lots of ways in which the human genome has changed to help people deal better with the environments they're in. Now, that's one way of looking at genetics and lifestyle. That's the evolutionary perspective. But presumably that's happened for good reasons, because it's helped people survive throughout evolution. But there are probably aspects of genomic adaptation that do not fit very well with today's environment. They may have been very useful during human evolution, but not very useful today when we live in environments that don't match our evolutionary environments. Now, we know that there are a number of factors that influence type 2 diabetes risk, and this is just a sort of collection of some of the most popular ones from the literature. We have nutritional factors. We have factors related with energy expenditure. Physical activity is an important part of that. We've got chemicals and viruses from smoking, endocrine disruptors that are present in plastics and other synthetic materials. And then we have circadian factors, how much daylight we're exposed to, and whether we sleep deprived. And then cognitive factors, psychological stress and depression. All of these things are thought to influence your risk of diabetes, affecting different organs in the body, and importantly, interacting with the genome. So this is, if you like, a bit of an overview of what we think we know about diabetes risk factors and how they work together with the genome to influence diabetes. Now, this is a real study. This is data taken from continuous glucose monitors. Some of you may use continuous glucose monitors. You may know what these are. But for those who don't, let me explain. They're essentially little devices that stick onto the skin, and using a process of osmosis, estimate the amount of glucose in the blood. And that will be recorded for a period of a week or 2 weeks, and then you download the device once you take it off the skin, and you can see how much glucose varied for a given individual. So these CGMs, or continuous glucose monitors, were put on 800 Israeli adults in this particular study. And this is taking 2 of these adults, participant 445 and participant 644, and showing what happened to their glucose when they ate bananas and when they ate cookies. They're not really blue cookies. This is just a picture. But when they ate cookies. So what you can see is that in this person, participant 445, they ate a banana and their blood glucose went up pretty dramatically. But when they ate a cookie, it didn't. It didn't make any difference to their blood glucose. Whereas this person had a peak when they ate cookies, but not when they ate bananas. So you see this individual variability in the relationship between food and banana and glucose. Now, if we could harness that information, what we might be able to do is move away from this kind of model where we have a sort of population-based approach towards diabetes prevention, towards one where we can define, using perhaps measures of your genome or other biological measures, who's likely to respond well to a given lifestyle intervention without side effects, who's likely to respond well but with side effects, and those two options are acceptable, versus those who will not respond and will get the side effects, or will not respond and not get the side effects. And if we could do that, and we had a good marker, a genetic marker, let's say, then this is probably what we would end up with, which is the ability to subdivide a patient population using information like genetics into a subgroups that are most likely to respond well to a given therapy with the fewest side effects and at the lowest cost. And that concept, which is what Leif talks a little bit about, is something called precision medicine, and it's something that people like me think we can probably achieve with lifestyle over the next decade or so. So I'm going to stop there. I think we have a little bit of time for questions, maybe.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. Yes, bra.